Mendez oversee all of the infectious diseases work. Now the global health security within the tuberculosis. Even actually got TB going in USA 2 years ago.
They actually infected about 30 of the employees, and then
That's exactly.
I will make reference that I wrote the first global report from the EventID that was shown in 1997. And at the country, I didn't understand policy.
hello, sir. How are you? It's good to see you.
Good to see you, Congressman. Thank you.
Great to see you. Thanks for doing this.
Hey,
Yeah.
I'm going to miss this batch, but there'll be a few others that I'll have to do.
Yeah.
I apologize.
Don't even worry about it.
The messiness of all.
Yeah, it's fine.
But I think we should start.
Okay.
very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Extremely valuable.
No worries. It's good to see you.
So, we will come to order, and good afternoon to everybody. Our hearing today is extremely urgent, focused on addressing what may very well be the next global health crisis, drug-resistant tuberculosis. Just as Ebola surprised many with its ferocity at which it spread, all of us must be concerned that the world is not fully prepared to meet the threat from this highly contagious airborne disease which killed 1.5 million people last year, and that translates to about 4,000 people a day, 4,000 lives that ended prematurely, including many young children. The World Health Organization released its global tuberculosis report just over a month ago and appealed to the world to beef up efforts to combat TB. And yesterday in Cape Town, South Africa, the International Union Against Tuberculosis and Lung Disease concluded its annual meeting, having gathered experts in fighting TB from all over the world. These are positive signs showing that the global community continues to surge towards ending TB by 2035 or sooner. While most TB is curable if diagnosed and patients strictly adhere to a treatment regimen, some 6 million new cases of TB were reported to WHO in 2014. However, it is likely that the number is far higher. Some put it at approximately 9.6 million people. These individuals need to be diagnosed with a diagnostic that is fast and reliable and able to detect drug resistance and treated so that they can lead healthy and productive lives. On a myriad of fronts, there is reason for hope. For example, the expert MTB-RAF can diagnose TB and resistance to rifampicin within 2 hours. And Dr. Frieden, in his testimony, elaborates on that within 2 hours, which is an amazing breakthrough. As Dr. Frieden will testify today, this new diagnostic holds great promise, enabling rapid detection of drug resistance, and the U.S. government has led the global effort to scale up access to this test. The increase in the proportion of drug-resistant TB cases diagnosed and started on treatment over the past several years is largely attributable to this kind of test. Yet the tragic fact remains that some 480,000 new cases of hard-to-treat cases of multi-drug resistant TB, a disease which far too often, hits the poorest of the poor and are estimated to have occurred in 2014, yet only about 25% of those cases, or 123,000 individuals, were detected and reported, leaving a whopping 75% undetected and untreated. Given the ease at which TB can spread through the air, especially through coughing, and the fact that people with weakened immune systems are more susceptible, one can see how left untreated MDR TB and its even more pernicious cousin XDR, or extensively drug-resistant TB, can be absolutely catastrophic to individuals and wreak havoc on public health and public health systems. To illustrate how fragile health systems can be overwhelmed, of course, a course of treatment for normal drug-susceptible TB costs roughly between $100 and $500, depending on the country. For MDR TB, the cost is roughly $5,000 and to $100,000, and some put the numbers at far, far higher than that. To respond fully to the TB crisis, WHO estimates that some $8 billion per year is needed. Unfortunately, there is a global budget shortfall of about $1.4 billion. We need to lead not only in terms of providing funding, but also in terms of encouraging other countries, but also the private sector and foundations in meeting this need by closing that gap. Now is the time for a significantly enhanced response to build on the tremendous work that people like Dr. Goozby and others have been doing. A sustained focus on tuberculosis prevention today will save lives and money tomorrow, helping people the world over, as well as protecting their homelands from what otherwise could be a global pandemic. Our three witnesses today are extraordinary leaders in the health field and experts on TB. They, like many others on the subcommittee, believe we can at least mitigate TB in the short term and eliminate this deadly infectious disease by 2035, just as the global community successfully fought polio and other debilitating diseases and deadly diseases. It takes political will, however, and an investment of resources that will pay dividends for healthier people in the long run. The subcommittee will continue to work hard on combating TB, along with members of the House Tuberculosis Elimination Caucus, whose co-chair, Elliot Engel, will be here shortly to join us. We have also, I'd like to now yield to Dr. Barra for any comments he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for convening this hearing, and I want to thank the witnesses as well. Great panel. I will keep my comments short so we can hear from the witnesses. But as a physician and public health expert, the scourge of tuberculosis is one that we constantly have to be vigilant on, and certainly I do worry that we're falling behind given our arsenal and what medications we have, and certainly having multi-drug resistant tuberculosis emerging, and extremely multi-drug resistant tuberculosis is a global challenge. It's not just limited to developing countries. As we think about the interconnected nature of the world, we are clearly have to be concerned about it, combating extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis, in the countries where it is starting to become endemic, but then also knowing that we've got to invest the money and the dollars in research and coming up with those next therapies and so forth, and I think we are falling behind there. So with that, I'm excited about the topic and look forward to hearing from the witnesses.
Thank you, Dr. Barr. I'd like to now introduce our first panelist, Dr. Eric Goozby, who currently serves as UN Special Envoy on tuberculosis, a position he was appointed to in January by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. In his capacity as Special Envoy, Dr. Goozby works towards raising the profile of the fight against TB and promoting the adoption, financing, and implementation of the World Health Organization's global anti-TB strategy, while pursuing the tuberculosis 2015 targets described in the Millennium Development Goals, which soon will be supplanted by the post-2015 goals beginning January 1st. He previously served 4 years in the U.S. State Department as Ambassador at Large and U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator, and no stranger to this subcommittee, and I again want to thank him for his availability as well as his exemplary work over the years. But in that position, he oversaw the implementation of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. Ambassador Goozby returned to the University of California, San Francisco, where he is Professor of Medicine and Director of the Global Health Delivery and Diplomacy, Global Health Sciences. Dr. Goozby, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking members, Member Barra, it is a privilege to be with you today at this important hearing on drug-resistant tuberculosis and its potential to turn into the next global health crisis. TB is now the #1 infectious disease killer in the world, surpassing HIV and AIDS according to the latest World Health Organization report on TB. We have a visual here to help you understand that. In this case, being #1 is not an achievement. There's no trophy for taking more lives than any other disease. As Congressman Smith said, as the chairman said, 4,100 people a day die from TB. Of the estimated 9 million annual deaths from all infectious causes, 1.5 million are attributed to tuberculosis. That translates into 1 out of 6 deaths of all infectious diseases. An estimated 1 million children became ill with TB, and 140,000 children died in 2014. Today, we can prevent, treat, and cure tuberculosis. The world has joined together to set the goal to end TB by 2035, but we will not do so without radically changing the path we are on. At the current rate, reducing incidence by 1.5% per year, it will take nearly 200 years to achieve this goal. Putting in place universal health coverage for an essential set of healthcare interventions, including TB diagnosis and treatment, will be of great importance if we want to successfully combat TB and other infectious and non-communicable diseases. The problem of TB is not evenly distributed around the world. Today, there are 22 high-burden countries that account for 83% of the cases. That said, the problem we have to come to discuss, namely multi-drug resistant TB, varies dramatically by geography in terms of the concentration of cases and the severity of resistance. While major strides have been made in the effort to reduce the burden of TB, the emergence of drug-resistant organisms presents a major challenge to patients and doctors. Of the 480,000 cases of multi-drug resistant TB, MDR-TB, estimated to have occurred in 2014, only about a quarter of these, as the chairman said, were detected and reported. In addition, treatment success rates are very low at less than 50%. Most cases come from previously treated TB patients who develop resistance, but this year the WHO reported a 50% increase in the percentage of patients who contract the disease directly from infected individuals. Remember, this is an airborne disease. Many countries that bear the largest burden of MDR-TB are important strategic partners to the United States. More than half of the global burden of MDR-TB is carried by the BRICS countries and other emerging economies. The Russian Federation and Ukraine have the highest proportions among all new MDR cases. India, China, and the Russian Federation consist of over 45% of all the globally estimated numbers of MDR cases. An estimated 9.7% of people with MDR-TB have XDR-TB, and countries like India, Ukraine, and South Africa reported the highest number of XDR-TB cases. With our current drugs regimens, we only succeed in treating 20% successfully of XDR patients. Chairman Smith rightly warned last month that we must not allow multi-drug resistance to develop further, as the climb to successfully combating TB becomes much steeper. Left unchecked, drug-resistant TB alone could account for 1 in 4 deaths from antibiotic infections by 2050. Drug-resistant TB services for addressing drug-resistant TB in the U.S. and abroad must be scaled up immediately. Excuse me. Serious detection and treatment gaps for drug-resistant TB remain. Of the $13 billion in TB funding required in 2015, about 2/3 are for the detection and treatment of drug-susceptible TB and 1/3 for MDR-TB treatment. Today, only $6 million is funded, and recent plans indicate that greater funding is required for MDR-TB globally, as well for the capacity building for healthcare workers to provide high-quality care. We need to find new resources to not only prevent this disease from shattering lives, but also invest in research that will enable us to save more lives. It's imperative that we focus our efforts on calling out the tragedy, which often strikes the voiceless. Those who suffer do so in silence. We need to be their voice. We need to unleash the outrage. We need to accelerate the political backing and momentum to make the bold strides needed to drive down the epidemic. While the call is urgent, there are signs of hope. Death rates from tuberculosis have dropped by nearly 1/2 since 1990, and the MDG target calling for halting and reversing TB incidence by 2015 has been achieved globally. I applaud these achievements. It took many governments worldwide that have large-scale and sustainable programs providing basic TB care in their primary health services. And many countries with high TB HIV burdens are mounting a solid response to the joint epidemics, with prevention and care being scaled up, but not yet with full coverage. It is also critical to note that TB interventions are cost-effective and save lives. TB is the most effective health intervention, bearing a $43 return for every $1 invested. I know firsthand the experience of having tuberculosis. When I was a young doctor, I was diagnosed with latent TB. I was fortunate. I was diagnosed, active disease was ruled out, and treatment with INH for 6 months was initiated, which successfully rid my body of the disease. Unfortunately, as you know, this is not the case for everyone. Some people remain undiagnosed. Some find the regimen too difficult to follow, or particularly in the developing world, too expensive for active TB. And others become resistant to the drugs they are using. It is these people who drive me to work on this issue, just as I am sure they drive you. The world owes a great deal of thanks to Congress and to the Obama administration for making global health a priority. I want to personally thank the subcommittee for its efforts to provide generous resources in the fight against TB. But this fight must also be a shared responsibility among all partners. Last week at a global summit on TB in Cape Town, mentioned by the chairman, I challenged all of the global health players involved with TB to take a hard look at their resources and how they are being used. We need to better understand what is being spent on TB and match our funding against the unmet needs. By doing this, we not only can fill in the gaps, we can eliminate duplication and parallel systems and identify and engage synergies that ensure resources are truly additive. Excuse me. In other words, let's ensure that low-income and the most vulnerable communities worldwide are first, not last, in our efforts to fight TB. Let's also ensure that we are not pitting one disease against another. It does not do any good to rob Peter to pay Paul. We can't save children from malaria and have them die from TB. We need investments across the board in global health. Investments bent the incidence curve on HIV. It was dramatic, and we saw this. And we can do the same for tuberculosis. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to leave you with a story. In last month's Tampa Bay Times, Dr. Jennifer Frieden, a senior lecturer at Harvard Medical School, wrote an op-ed about her firsthand experience in dealing with children with TB in Lesotho. She writes, quote, "I cannot forget seeing an 8-year-old boy as he crawled across to play with his friends. Being on all fours was not part of the fun, but his only means of mobility. An infection in his knees caused by multi-drug-resistant TB left him unable to walk or to stand. Resilient in the face of his illness, he looked to the sky with a shy grin as the other children shouted, 'Crab, crab, come and get us, crab.' But the playful laughter was soon replaced by silence. The young boy was killed by MDR-TB, and his sister and mother are also ill with the disease now." Close quotes. Sadly, this story is heard all too often. We can prevent, diagnose, and cure drug-sensitive TB, but MDR-TB increasingly presents a serious challenge. We can and must do better. I thank you for your time.
Dr. Goozby, thank you so much for your very powerful insights and, again, your tremendous leadership over the years. If you just, with regards to new drugs and new diagnostics, I would note that bedaquiline is new, yet it has a high toxicity, particularly towards the liver. And my question is, what can be done to incentivize pharmaceuticals here and anywhere else in the world, particularly in Europe, where there's a highly sophisticated pharmaceutical industry, given this explosion of cases, are there many ideas in the pipeline or compounds that are being looked at? And secondly, on the diagnostics, the expert MTB, RAF, I know that the U.S. government, and Dr. Frieden speaks about this in his testimony, and is being exported, but waiting weeks or months for a diagnosis could lead to more drug resistance, and a false diagnosis is that, because that might be missed, the resistance part. For example, at your meeting you just had in South Africa, was there an emphasis on new drugs and diagnostics and getting some of these very important new initiatives out.
Well, Chairman, I think you really hit the one of the sensitive areas in the response to global TB burden. Having adequate drug treatment is critical. As we have said, you can diagnose and treat tuberculosis for drug-sensitive TB. 87% of the time, people who take these medications correctly are cured with that engagement. It requires a 6-month treatment course, but it requires, to do it safely, that the person be in care, linked to a monitoring and delivery system that can monitor the effects of the drugs on especially the liver and kidney, and have been problem in identifying, entering, and retaining people effective that again require continued monitoring, that have been approved by our FDA for drug treatment for multi-drug and XDR resistance. Interestingly, they are also effective in drug-sensitive treatment, but are being reserved for the multi-drug XDR moment. The ability to get people in delivery systems that can diagnose resistant organism and not inappropriately start drug-sensitive medications at the first initiation of treatment is the critical piece that must be focused on. The pressure to generate multi-drug resistant and XDR TB comes out of individuals who take the medication inappropriately, go on and off of 1 or 2 of the drugs, and put a pressure, an environmental pressure, on the organism to favor the resistant outbreak. That can be changed by better retention and better education continuously throughout their treatment period. And the strategies for that have been identified, but have not been brought to scale or sustained in the manner that's needed to prevent MDR-XDR development. The gene expert is a remarkable thing. Tom will speak to this. It has allowed us not to have to grow and culture an organism that grows very slowly and takes up to 6-8 weeks for us to actually get it to grow out of culture so we can identify it, and then identify whether or not it contains resistance to the effective mycobacterial cidal drugs, INH and rifampin. The ability to do that with the gene expert is in about 2 hours, what had been 6 weeks routinely. Plus, the patient stays in front of you. You don't have them go off, have to find them to bring them back to interpret the results and initiate the appropriate treatment. So Gene Expert is a sea change in our ability to minimize the pressures in the system that favored the development of resistance.
In terms of a sea change, how many diagnostic kits do you think can be supplied worldwide? What's the capability
Oh,
there?
you know, I think some of my colleagues may have an answer to that. They are at a fraction of what they are needed in any given country. Many of the U.S. systems, PEPFAR, the USAID systems in tuberculosis, have invested early on in the Gene Expert machine to make their availability wider, but it's a fraction of what's totally, what the total
And does it
amount is.
detect for other antibiotics as well, or just the one?
It looks for resistance to rifampin, one of the bactericidal or antibiotics, and it also looks in the new formulations. It'll look for INH, rifampin, and they have formulations now, cassettes that are being set up to look for other forms of antibiotic resistance that would give you a diagnosis for multi-drug and XDR TB.
You mentioned that more than half of the global burden of MTR-TB is borne by the BRICS countries and other emerging economies. You didn't mention Brazil. Do you have some insights on Brazil?
Brazil is a country that is heavily burdened with the response to tuberculosis. Again, something that is known but has not moved to scale yet in the country. They are struggling with the knowledge of how to diagnose and treat, but not having it available to all of those in the population that need it. Their economic wobble that they're on now has created an interval in their ability to invest in it as a country, and they are now in need of support globally to try to get over this period of economic decline.
Let me just ask you with regards to so many people with compromised immune systems, which seems to be an ascendancy. My own
Yes.
wife has a
Yes.
autoimmune disease, and it seems there are growing numbers of those cases, which makes obviously she and so many others more susceptible. Do you see, I mean, as Dr. Frieden points out, there is 92, I think it was the point where we hit, we've gone down ever since here in the United States. If you could speak to, this trend, it seems to be, of autoimmune diseases that are throughout the country. And secondly, if you could answer that, then I'll do my final question.
Sure.
and go to Dr. Barrett.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think you're right to point out that the susceptibility to tuberculosis goes across a spectrum of diseases that engage or diminish your immune system's ability to respond to an infectious agent, identify the organism, and clear it. The identification often is not the difficult part, but having the ability for your white cells and so-called cell-mediated response to come in and clear that organism from the body to sterilize it has been a big part of why individuals who are immuno-challenged, immunocompromised, like with HIV, those with collagen vascular diseases, those who've had chemotherapy, the third trimester of pregnancy, and just aging as your immune system wanes, increases your vulnerability to developing active disease with the same exposure. The defect in cell-mediated response is especially bad for those who are HIV positive. The susceptibility to gaining active disease from the same exposure in an HIV-infected person has been estimated to be over 100 times that of the HIV-negative individual, and explains why tuberculosis remains the leading killer for HIV-infected people on the planet.
Final question? Oh,
Excuse
sorry.
me.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say the ability to identify those aspects of the immune response that makes them susceptible to active TB is a critical target for research. And our ability to understand this is well within our realm of our understanding of immunology, but we have not applied our immunologic tools to characterize the more subtle responses that individuals have when exposed to TB in their immune system. NIH is now primed, as is CDC, to take those studies through to completion because in many ways they follow the same path that was used to characterize the immunologic response, description of the natural history, pathophysiology for HIV. So those labs are set up and ready to turn to TB.
Last question. Since 2007, we've, in the United States, as you know so well, have been doing very aggressive screening among the immigrant population, legal immigrants, this is, and the refugees, the 450,000 immigrants and 70,000 refugees annually. And matter of fact, it's so stringent that if somebody has TB, they have to come in without it, or they're inadmissible to the United States. 7 weeks ago, I held a hearing on Syrian refugees, and we had the regional representative for the UNHCR as one of our witnesses, Petterman, who did a wonderful job, and he talked about the fact that the gross underfunding of the refugees, including the appeals, we have more people who are displaced, IDPs, or genuine refugees than ever before. And yet the appeals go out from the UNHCR and 41, 44, 43% comes back, so we're underfunding it. And that the trigger for this mass exodus into Europe and someday to the United States was, frankly, the World Food Program cut of 30%, which put a number of people to flight thinking that they were hopeless. Huge migrations of people across borders. Many people are sick, compromised immunity, I would think, as a result. Since we're doing such robust screening on at least legal immigrants, what is the UN looking to do with all of these mass flows of individuals who could be carrying these horrific diseases, putting themselves, their families, and then anyone else with whom they have come in contact with at risk of getting TB?
Well, Chairman, you bring a terrific point forward. Our colleagues in the European sector, as this immigration occurs, are scrambling to try to mount a humane and responsive screening mechanism that allows those individuals who are suffering from underlying diseases that can be diagnosed and treated, those that indeed may afford a risk to their new population that they're entering, but also afford a risk to themselves and their families, need to be screened for, identified, diagnosed, and treated.
Are any countries doing that? Particularly
Countries-
European countries, Germany, for example, are they screening? for
They are
TB?
doing it once people get to the country, but are not doing it in a refugee status to the degree that they need to. They're at a very early stage in mounting that response. On the downside, they need to do more. On the upside is they realize that and are really working to gain a global awareness that results in, hopefully, investment by the global community in trying to put a screening capability in place.
Is there any preliminary data from like Germany or any of the other countries that
I'm not aware of any, Mr. Chairman, that I would be willing to give to you at this point, but I will look into that and come back to you with it.
Appreciate that. Dr. Burr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you for your testimony, Dr. Goozby. As one of those young interns who started my residency negative on my skin test and turned positive, I was grateful for that surveillance program. I was grateful that I was able to have the latent TB infection treated, and it does talk about the importance of surveillance. In my public health career as chief medical officer, two of the programs that I directed for Sacramento County was the refugee screening program, which was exactly that. We have a large Eastern European refugee population in the Sacramento area. You'd have rudimentary screening in their country of origin, so we would certainly do much more robust screening on arrival, and obviously tuberculosis was one of the entities that we were looking for. A second program that we treated that we had under my jurisdiction was the chest clinic, which was our TB surveillance program in Sacramento County. And as you've rightfully pointed out, a key component of treating tuberculosis is not just making the diagnosis of active TB, getting the patient on the right therapy, but then making sure, and our program was a directly observed therapy program where you were sending public health nurses out there on a regular basis, observing them take their medications, because that is the risk that we run, right? Folks starting the medications, not completing therapy, and then we run into this issue of a limited arsenal. A couple questions. You talked about GeneXpert and the ability to better sort out, susceptibility and sensitivity to the arsenal. I may have missed it. I think Chairman Smith asked the cost of GeneXpert. Is it,
So there was the R&D costs, and then there was the initial kind of formulation of the machinery. All of that now being tucked and settled.
Right.
The cartridge cost started at about $24 for each sputum examined to determine whether it was resistant, had mycobacterium, and whether or not there was rifampin resistance. That now went down to $10 with investments from USAID and PEPFAR back in 2013. And now it's down to below $8, and with kind of unit price scale up, will actually drop below that.
And the actual machinery is of a size that you can have out in the field with you. So if you were to go take this to a refugee camp, let's say.
It is of the size that you could take out in the field. It's the size of a small computer, about this high, down there, about that wide. The cartridges are, you stick them into the machine and literally can take not just, it won't evaluate sputum only, but spit will be good enough because it's a PCR generated test. So you don't have to induce sputum like you do for a normal smear positivity and staining exercise. And that advantage alone makes it hugely impactful. It can run on solar power, and we have many examples of that, and doesn't require a cold chain to keep specimens and store specimens. There's also a whole technology trying to look at how to preserve specimens without a cold chain for days that will allow for pooling and aggregation of specimens so you can run batches. All of that technology has been worked out but has not been brought to scale.
So there is an urgency of getting this to scale and getting this out to the field as quick as possible. If we think about the 1.5 million cases of tuberculosis, what percentage would you say are INH rifampin sensitive versus not sensitive?
So about of the initial cases of tuberculosis, less than 3% actually are carrying resistance MDR in the whole pool of TB. And of the 3% that develop MDR, about 10% of those cases can develop XDR TB.
So again, if we're thinking about a global strategy here, it is incredibly important that we don't overuse our arsenal of this,
yes,
our super antibiotics here, and that we actually, again, if what you're saying is 97% are still sensitive to INH and rifampin, the danger we run into is that we just treat everything with our most effective medications, and then we start losing those. And so the starting point is really getting to scale, getting this gene expert out there into the field, and recognizing that, here's the 97% of folks that we can treat with our usual medications. So we just save our latest medications for those that are multi-drug resistant or extremely multi-drug resistant. We've seen what has happened in general antibiotic use over time, where we go to the next latest and greatest antibiotic therapy, and we start to develop this drug resistance, whereas we've got to be vigilant. So certainly as we're investing in those next therapies and so forth, we've still got a good arsenal in INH and rifampin. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be investing in the next generation, the next arsenal, and staying ahead of this, but we should make sure we're using the appropriate medications.
Your background speaks to your wisdom with that. You're absolutely right. Part of our task is to be excellent in making the diagnosis and identifying those who are carrying resistant organism, and then putting them on the appropriate medication, not inappropriately or unnecessarily using the medication that we want to reserve for those who indeed hold resistant organism. I think that your time in Sacramento showed you how easy, and with all the well-meaning in the world, you can do that. And I believe that the widely available presence of XDR, ability to diagnose MDR, XDR, TB, will preempt that evolution. Right now we have a moment to prevent that evolution from going, is your point. Completely agree with you. And the urgent need for drugs in the pipeline and for other diagnostics to continue to be on the working table is also evident to all of us who've done this a long time, and that we see how fragilely we are standing on a precipice that we could go over and never be able to recover from.
And Chairman Smith alluded to the fact that we have gotten ahead of this in the United States, but would you articulate why folks here domestically have to be concerned with the emergence and escalation of TB around the world?
Well, I think the next two speakers are expert in this threat. Our ability to move people in hours from one area of the world to another is well established. Airplanes and an airborne disease such as tuberculosis is, and its ability to spread affords a real threat in that regard. It is short-sighted to think that we need to wait until a patient comes in from a foreign life where TB is endemic and they are infected, and then manifest with symptoms here in this country. We have to be vigilant but compassionate in our ability to identify, enter, and retain these patients and people in care and services. Our country has open arms in the immigration sense. This is a threat that makes us question if we are doing this correctly, but we are smart enough to figure out how to do it safely.
Right. And again, just for the domestic audience, while we may think of tuberculosis as a disease that infects lower income immigrant populations, et cetera. What we know is, since it's an airborne disease, having done some of these epidemiologic surveys, when you get these outbreaks, it's not limited to those populations. It spreads, and it is much better to prevent and get ahead of this than, it can affect anyone. So
Absolutely right.
great.
Absolutely right.
Well, thank you for being here. I don't know.
Mr. Engel?
Okay, that's better. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to thank our ranking member, Congresswoman Bass, and our witnesses for appearing here today. I'm the ranking member of the entire committee, of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, but also have done a lot of work on the fight against tuberculosis. It's been a priority for me for a long time. So many people around the world needlessly suffer from this disease, and investing in diagnosis and treatment helps build healthier communities in the developing world, something I try to achieve through the Stop TB Now Act, much of which became law in 2008. And we know that healthier communities are stronger and more prosperous. So for me, this is a foreign policy priority as well as a global health priority. We like to think of tuberculosis as a disease quickly becoming part of the past, and after all, we've made wonderful strides in the fight against TB. But between 2000 and 2014, effective diagnosis and treatment accounted for 43 million lives saved. That's great. Since I came to Congress nearly 27 years ago, the worldwide TB death rate has dropped by nearly 50%. And here in the U.S., the number of annual deaths due to TB has dropped by 2/3 just since 1992. And we know how to diagnose this disease. We know how to cure it. So in some ways, we seem to be headed in the right direction when it comes to wiping out tuberculosis. But the reality, however, is that TB has become the #1 infectious killer worldwide. 1.5 million people, including 140,000 children, died from TB last year. And during that same period, nearly 10 million people became infected with the disease, and nearly 500,000 developed multi-drug resistant TB. And we know people fighting HIV/AIDS also are very prone to getting TB as well. So while we've made real progress fighting tuberculosis, we need to stay focused and finish the job. So I thank you, Doctor, for all the good work that you do. Obviously, we need to be clear-eyed about the challenge that remains, set ambitious goals, and do what it takes to reach these aims. And for example, I'm glad that the UN included the fight against TB in its Sustainable Development Goals. Ending the global TB epidemic by 2030 won't be easy, but it's a good first step that the UN is prioritizing this effort. And let me just say, finally, as a co-chair of the TB Elimination Caucus, I'll continue talking about this issue and pushing for a robust investment in TB research and treatment. I'm pleased that this subcommittee is taking the time to examine this problem. I look forward to a good discussion. I thank you for your partnership. Doctor, thank you, and all the other people, even in the audience, who have worked so hard and made this a priority in their lives. I yield back. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Engel. And another example where there's just close bipartisanship, cooperation, and support the way it ought to be. And I want to thank my good friend for his leadership for these many, many years. I would like to ask you just finally, and maybe you can get back to us on this, but as you come across members of parliament, executive branch members that you think we might liaison with and talk to and try to get a stronger concerted effort, please let us know. I think, I chair the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe Parliamentary Assembly. I work on trafficking and a whole host of issues. And I often find when you bring up an issue like this, they say, oh, Joe or Jim or Mary, they work on this too. You ought to talk to them. And since you're in contact with them all the time, it would be, it'd be open door invitation for us to work with like-minded parliamentarians. Thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Goozby. Let me now invite to the witness table our second panel, beginning with Dr. Tom Frieden, who's been the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention since June of 2009, and has dedicated his career to fighting infectious and chronic diseases both here in the United States and abroad. He led New York City's program that controlled tuberculosis and reduced multi-drug resistant cases by 80%, and worked in India as well for 5 years, helping to build a tuberculosis control program that has saved nearly 3 million lives. As the Commissioner of New York City's Health Department, Dr. Frieden led programs that reduce illness and death and increase life expectancy substantially. He is a recipient of numerous awards and honors and has published more than 200 scientific articles that have, and has previously testified before this committee, and we welcome him back. And without objection, all of your full resumes, which are very, very distinguished, will be made a part of the record. And then we'll go to the Honorable Ariel Pablos-Mendez, who is the Assistant Administrator for Global Health at USAID, a position he assumed in August of 2011. Dr. Pablos-Mendez joined USAID's leadership team with a vision to shape the Bureau for Global Health's efforts to accomplish a measurable and sustainable impact on the lives of people in developing countries, and he has been doing that and doing it extremely well. Prior to joining USAID, he worked on global health strategy and the transformation of health systems in Africa and Asia. He was also served as the Director of Knowledge Management at the World Health Organization. Dr. Pablos-Mendez is a board-certified internist and until recently was a professor of clinical medicine and epidemiology at Columbia University. Dr. Frieden, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith and Congressman Engel, for your interest and leadership addressing this and other critically important global health issues. I'm here as CDC Director, but I have spent much of my career working on the issue of tuberculosis and support for tuberculosis patients. I'd like to tell you about one of them. In the early 1990s, while I was working as an epidemic intelligence service officer and then director of the Bureau of Tuberculosis Control program in New York City, I treated a young man from Kerala, India. He had what we would now call extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, or XDR-TB. I treated him for close to 2 years. He required the resection of part of his lung, experimental treatment, and treatment with injectable antibiotics, which his wife, fortunately a nurse, was able to provide for him for a period of well over 18 months. Fortunately, he was able to be cured of his disease. At that time, many years ago, it cost over $100,000 for his care. Years later, while working on secondment from CDC to the World Health Organization in India, I was able to go to his home village in Kerala, where we were able to establish a program that would have prevented his case of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis for $10. In New York City, we documented the outbreak of the largest outbreak of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis to have ever occurred in this country, and we also documented its very rapid control. And that brings me to the 3 key points I would like to make about tuberculosis. First, it's a big problem. Second, we can stop it. And third, the CDC plays a pivotal role in that global effort. It's a big problem, as you know. Last year, 1.5 million people died from a disease that is virtually 100% curable. In addition, we're seeing increasingly drug-resistant strains of the organism, and this is a reflection not only of a failure of effective programs, but also of a failure of investment and coordination. Tuberculosis affects society and increases poverty. It's also a reflection of challenges that countries have to support patients and effective health systems. If you look at the countries where tuberculosis is spreading most widely, they have the combination of poverty, HIV, in some cases a government system that's not providing as effective care as it can, in some cases a private healthcare system that's providing chaotic and irrational treatments for tuberculosis. And as a result of that, you're seeing lots of spread in communities and in healthcare systems. And one thing to really emphasize is the risk of spread within healthcare facilities. Both Dr. Berra and Dr. Goozby commented on having become infected with tuberculosis during their training. I have to mention that I'm a member of that club as well, having become infected working in a tuberculosis clinic in New York City. Again, preventive treatment, greatly reducing my risk of ever developing the disease in the future. But that's just an example of what happens. Around the world, people with HIV get infected in hospitals and go on to develop disease. In New York City in the early 1990s, we were able to show with one of the first molecular epidemiological studies ever done of tuberculosis that a large proportion of cases, in fact, perhaps even more than half of all of the multi-drug resistant cases in New York City at that time were picked up in the hospital. So the first point is it's a big problem. The second point is that we can stop TB. We need political will. We need to build on momentum. We need investment. We need commitments that are matched by resources, both from within countries, multilaterally and bilaterally. We also have better diagnostics now. And as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, we've gone from 2 months to 2 days to the diagnosis of multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis. And there are many different technologies. GeneXpert is one very strong one that's being used for TB and other pathogens. There are others as well. And there will be others coming down the pike. In the US, we're using forms of sequencing large parts of the TB genome to be able to get resistance testing to first and second line drugs, at least on a preliminary basis, in real time throughout the US, and that's been a very successful pilot. We also need to improve the treatment and the treatment of patients as the VIP of the program. TB patients all over the world don't get the services they need to complete treatment, and that's not just bad for them and their families, that's bad for all of us. That's why the TB patient has to be the VIP of the program, and effectively managed programs treat them as such. We also need to ensure that there is effective supervision and the core technical excellence continues. We continue to hear all too often about medications not being available, diagnostics not being available, patients not being supported through the course of their treatment. And of course, we continue to need continuous innovation. That we have the tools we have today because of innovations. We'll have better tools if we continue to innovate. At CDC, within this country, we coordinate a network of experts in the treatment of multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis with extensive experience. This includes physicians, laboratory workers, public health outreach workers, public health nurses, implementation experts, and others. We have a very successful program, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, on refugee and immigrant screening. It's really a triple win. What we've done is to strengthen the diagnostic and treatment capacity in countries all over the world. That means that not just for immigrants and refugees, but for other people in those countries, there's a better opportunity to be accurately diagnosed and effectively treated. It's a win for these individuals because they're more likely to be cured, and it's a win for the U.S. because we've been able to treat just over the last 2 years close to 3,000 patients around the world who didn't come here with tuberculosis. So this is a very successful and cost-effective program. We also have at CDC unique expertise in areas such as infection control, where we're hoping to reduce the risk that people will pick up tuberculosis in clinics and hospitals all around the world, and a unique opportunity to advance research. We've been in our laboratory validating and extending and creating some new tools for diagnostics. Some of the drugs that are currently being used were first studied in our own laboratory, and of course we all hope that at some point in the future there will be a vaccine for tuberculosis, although at present we have nothing to offer beyond a vaccine that protects children against some forms of TB. Also, with support from Congress, we're expanding the global health security agenda, and in this regard, expanding programs to track and stop drug-resistant, including tuberculosis. And of course, the PEPFAR program, which Dr. Goozby ran for many years, is critically important in providing treatment for HIV, which will reduce the rate of TB, and for TB, which is the most deadly opportunistic infection among people living with HIV, killing nearly 1/3 of the people with HIV who die each year. In conclusion, there's one core fact I'd like us always to remember about multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis and drug-resistant tuberculosis in general, and it's this. No program can treat drug-resistant tuberculosis faster than a poorly organized program can spread and create drug-resistant tuberculosis. Therefore, it's essential that we focus on the core aspects of providing high-quality diagnosis and treatment to all patients with tuberculosis, those with susceptible tuberculosis and those with drug-resistant tuberculosis. TB is nearly 100% curable, but the biggest challenge to tuberculosis control and prevention and elimination efforts is the challenge of persistence. That individual patients, when their symptoms resolve, programs when it's no longer on the headlines, physicians, when they're not thinking of it longer, will not sustain the programs needed to sustain the progress which we can achieve to stop tuberculosis. And we look forward at CDC to continuing to work with Congress, with our agency partners from throughout the U.S. government, and with partners from affected countries and around the world to accelerate the cure and eventual elimination of tuberculosis. Thank you.
Dr. Frieden, thank you so very much. Dr. Pablos-Mendez.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith, Congressman Vera, and Engel, my own representative. Thank you for being champions for global health and for tuberculosis, and for allowing us into this room to testify on our work in tuberculosis and MDR-TB, a work that USAID has been doing for many, many years. I also want to thank Dr. Eric Goozby for his leadership and passionate comments. I guess all the 4 doctors in the room, Dr. Vera, we all have been infected with tuberculosis, so we all have personal experience. But also we go back a long way. When I was training in New York in the 80s actually, I'm older, and we began to notice MDR-TB among the homeless. And it was through tuberculosis that I think many of us got into the global health space. I worked with Tom Frieden in turning the tide of what at the time was a big outbreak of MDR-TB, accelerated by HIV. You will recall that people have forgotten tuberculosis in the United States by the 80s, and now we had an incredible flare. We did turn the tide in New York, and we feel confident we can also beat the disease globally. Since that situation in New York, the World Health Organization declared a global emergency, and a lot of effort has been going on in the international community that we didn't have really in the 80s. So the 90s begin to have a transformation. The US government stepped up the plate. I mean, all of the agencies began to work, and in the last 20 years, plenty has been happening, plenty has been accomplished. I was in 1997, I went to WHO for the first time, where we produced the first global report of MDR-TB. I came to testify on was the first piece of evidence on MDR-TB around the world. We show a big problem, of course, in Eastern Europe, had spots also in other parts of the world. When I joined the Rockefeller Foundation, I was very engaged in public-private partnerships, working with the NIH and the pharmaceutical companies to create now a new partnership, the Global Alliance for TB Drug Development, to begin the development of new drugs. None had been developed over 50 years, and we needed new drugs to fight the disease, not only to have new drugs in the armamentarium against MDR-TB, but also to make the treatment of tuberculosis shorter and simpler. Because as Tom has stated, if we can control TB in the right way, we can preempt the emergence and spread of MDR-TB. We also worked together in the year 2000, a pivotal year for global TB control, in the establishment of the Global TB Drug Facility, which the US government supported. I mean, USAID supported the first global surveillance report, and since has supported the Alliance for TB Drug Development, has supported now the Global TB Drug Facility, which is a platform that allows us to procure pre-qualified drugs and make it available to expand DOTS programs by national TB programs around the world. A lot has been done. I'm very proud of the work that the USAID and the US government, but we need to do more, and in new ways, no doubt. I mean, the problem that we are addressing MDR-TB is a big challenge. TB is now, as you heard, the leading infectious killer in the world, and I think that that's a very important signal. This year is an important piece of evidence that will help us rally attention and support in the fight against tuberculosis. In those 20 years where, thanks to your support, the commitments of the US government have increased. I mean, we started with about $10 million 20 years ago fighting tuberculosis. We are now, of course, far more than that. In that period of time, in that 20 year, tuberculosis was growing and then was stopped and has begun to decline. An 18% decline in the incidence of tuberculosis worldwide. The mortality, as we heard from the introductory commentary, has been nearly halved in these 20 years. So, and about 43 million lives have been saved by treating tuberculosis. Quite an impressive accomplishment in these 20 years. And there's no doubt the US government, in particular to all of our agencies, USAID as the lead international agency for TB control, has been truly the champions in this campaign. And we think we are doing okay, but not on MDR-TB. We need to do a lot more. We have put together, the US government, across the agencies, a new strategy, the strategy for the US government Global TB Strategy, which aims to reach, cure, and prevent tuberculosis. As we know, there's many patients who cannot at present be detected, and we have to increase that. And our goals by 2019 is to reduce the incidence further by 25%, maintain the success rate of those patients who are now being detected at 90%, successfully treat 13 million patients directly by our efforts, and initiate the treatment of 360 MDR-TB patients, as well as reaching all of the people who have HIV and TB with antiretroviral treatment. Our work is focused on about 54 countries, but we also extend the reach of the U.S. government commitment through the Global Fund, which reaches about 100 countries, providing more focused technical assistance to ensure that those resources are matched by others in the fight against tuberculosis. MDR-TB itself is, of course, the big challenge. And we heard before about the expert DNA testing system. It's been really a transformation in this decade, and it's the fruit of research, the fruit with the collaboration with the private sector. In the year 2011, there were about 500,000 cartridges distributed around the world. In last year, 5 million, so a tenfold increase in the spread of the expert system reach around the world, quite significant, not only for the MDR-TB detection and treatment, but also to detect regular TB among children that have been more difficulty in being diagnosed with the traditional methodologies. Likewise, in this, just since 2010, the treatment of MDR-TB has been tripled. There were about 20,000 patients put on MDR-TB treatment in the year 2010. Now we have tripled that, and with the Global Fund, we are doubling that. Still is not enough. We have many more patients that we need to diagnose and treat, but it gives you a sense of the great progress that we have had recently, thanks again to the bipartisan support of Congress and the work of the interagency in the United States, but also working with many partners. Our work is clearly leveraging the World Health Organization guidance to countries and the country's own ability to pay for tuberculosis control. Scaling up the treatment of MDR-TB will require more resources than we have at the moment. There's no doubt about that. But it also requires better ways to do what we do with the resources we do have. We have been working not only in investing in new diagnosis and new drugs, and new drugs are finally coming online, and they are not great yet. Indeed, we are working with bedaquiline, for example, a drug Congressman Smith noted, is indeed not a perfect drug, but it's a drug that has been approved by the FDA, the first such approved TB drug in 50 years, and is part of the development of new drugs coming in the pipeline. We are working on bedaquiline with J&J and Janssen Pharmaceuticals to begin to introduce. More than 4,000 patients have now been treated. We are learning. We are following WHO guidance carefully to learn further as we expand donation programs and others. It's a new drug. We have to be careful. We don't want to lose it, as Congressman Vera said. We have to be careful with those drugs, both in monitoring the toxicity. The truth is that many of the drugs we use today in tuberculosis, had they gone through the FDA approval today, may not have gone through. But they have been quite successful over the last 50 years, and we have to still do better in this regard. And as I said, MDR-TB will be important. We have been working, I'm very proud of the work the team has been doing, as someone who has been quite involved in drug for tuberculosis, the development, purchasing, and so on. There's been clever ways to work with the manufacturers, because we need to have drugs. And I remember in New York, Tom, that we didn't have, the manufacturers were not there. So working with the manufacturers to ensure that we have pre-qualified MDR-TB drugs has been very important. There were not many in 2007. We have been working with many of them. Now we have over 30 manufacturers capable to produce the drugs that we are using, and also working with them, exchanging technical assistance for price reductions that has led to a 50% reduction in the cost of MDR-TB regimes in these last 10 years. We need to do more. We need to do better. USAID is also working at the cutting edge of research. The NIH invests significantly, is the leading organization investing in research and for the US government, and we are working in the implementation science in the later phases of randomized clinical trials, working also on how we implement and expand treatment and diagnosis, and working in support. Most of the guidance that the WHO has put out has been the result of the support that we are doing, working with them technically and financially. We are in the midst now of the STREAM clinical trial, which is the first randomized clinical trial of MDR-TB long-term. We've been doing lots of pieces of that, but this is going to be a very significant effort for us going forward. And however, we agree, we need to do more. I think that the cost of TB control will run from $8 billion, cited by Chairman Smith, to about $13 billion by 2030. And so we need to almost double the commitments that we have today. But most of the high-burden countries in tuberculosis pay for 80% of the cost, and we have been quite focused. We're working on domestic resource mobilization. We want to make sure those governments supplement the taxpayers' money that we are bringing in with technical assistance, with international partnerships and so on, for them to take more ownership of that. And they're doing very well. I think South Africa, with the expansion of the expert system for diagnosis, has been a great example. India doubling their budgets for TB control. Many others, like Indonesia, where we have been working to expand a nationwide MDR TB diagnostic and treatment. So clearly we need to do that and continue to do that. In conclusion, we now recognize, of course, for a while tuberculosis has been around. We have done a lot of good work recently, but it is now the leading infectious killer in the world. And MDR TB is like Ebola with wings, indeed. It is something that can be as easy to acquire in a way as Ebola in terms of percentage over time, and has equivalent mortality untreated, and it can be transmitted, it's airborne. So you are right to be calling us attention to this important problem. The U.S. Government, the USAID efforts in the fight will be maintained with the strategy that we have right now for 2019, as well as a part of the global effort for TB. I think, importantly, we have stopped TB from growing, is now declining. We need to do the same thing with MDR TB. We can do it. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Doctor. Just let me begin the questioning. You know, in talking about the diagnostics, and diagnostics, if you're talking about Lyme disease or any other disease out there, the response is only as good as the diagnostics. And so the gene expert that's been talked about by all of you, how much does it cost? Who manufactures it? And are orders coming in or requests coming in all over the world for you know, to put it into this healthcare setting or that? And what kind of infrastructure does that require? Is it adaptable to a very rural situation in a developing country?
Maybe I'll start, and then Dr. Pablos-Mendez will continue. As you point out, Chairman Smith, the key is a laboratory network. A laboratory network includes a national lab that might be a reference lab, sometimes a supranational lab. At CDC, we've been able to support, for example, the African Society for Laboratory Medicine, which has strengthened laboratory systems in dozens of countries around Africa. And then within countries, you need to have the diagnosis at the point of care, or diagnosis at an intermediate level, and then at referral levels. At different tests are appropriate and effective for different levels of the healthcare system. We don't yet have the ideal test for tuberculosis. Today in West Africa, we're using point-of-care tests for Ebola that give us a preliminary result in 20 minutes. We don't have that for TB. But the Gene Expert is a major advance, as are other rapid molecular diagnostic tools, which allow us to get in a few hours at least a preliminary result, or in the case of Gene Expert, a definitive result about the presence of resistance mutations or the presence of tuberculosis bacteria. There are some requirements, some of them more fixed than others in terms of refrigeration and electrical supply. And I would emphasize that it doesn't replace the need to have and strengthen core diagnostic systems, including microscopy, sputum collection, sputum referral, specimen transport, and follow-up. But it's a very important new tool that's allowed us to greatly increase the diagnosis of drug-resistant TB, which is a preliminary step to improving the treatment of drug-resistant TB.
Thank you. Indeed, I think the laboratory structure Tom alluded to, and as we spoke of the overall surveillance of MDR-TB, all this network of global reference, regional reference laboratories, national reference laboratories, is indeed one of the best in class. I think in bacterial disease, it's been an incredible accomplishment. USAID has been a proud supporter of that global network of reference laboratories for surveillance. But as you go down, indeed, and as you go into the clinical phase, indeed depends on the network of laboratories on the ground. On the expert system, I think that we feel really has been a game changer, and it is in the process of scaling up. And Chairman Smith, I noted that in the year 2011, there were 500,000 cartridges. The cartridges are really straightforward, and in 2 hours, you can get a result that it used to take 6 weeks or more in the regular laboratory. Now, from 500,000, we have increased tenfold as of last year to about close to 5 million cartridges, which is quite a significant. And this is being driven now by the demand of countries themselves. We are working with WHO, with CDC, to provide the technical guidance, technical assistance, and the countries themselves are increasingly adapting this. India is now also working to develop even cheaper alternatives, and maybe they will succeed, but they've been good to do other things, and I think that that will add. The price of the cartridge itself came down from over $20 a piece to less than $10, and that alone has helped us save over $50 million in the last year or so. So I think that the economics of this system will allow us to continue the expansion and the demand because it's performing.
Let me just ask, the 2035, and this is not a, why end TB by 2035? Alzheimer's is 2025. The post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals are 2030. Was that arrived at with some realistic, set of benchmarks that might be achievable, or is it aspirational?
I would say it's aspirational. Fundamentally, we need to do two things in tuberculosis. First, implement what we know how to do but isn't getting well implemented everywhere. And there's still a big gap between what we could be doing and what we are doing. Far too many patients are not getting promptly diagnosed, not getting effectively treated, and far too much tuberculosis is spreading in healthcare facilities and elsewhere. We also need to continue to innovate. We need better diagnostics, we need better treatment, and ideally we would need a vaccine. So I don't see a clear pathway with the tools at hand to get to that goal. It is aspirational, but I do see a real urgency of doing those two things now. Implementing what we know better for more patients and continuing to learn more.
And Congressman Chairman Smith, if I may add, TB is different than most other infectious diseases, and you are really an expert because you've been looking into so many of them. But in many other diseases, as the problem of the disease shrinks, as the manifestation of the disease shrinks, usually the problem indeed is smaller, and over time you just end it. With tuberculosis, because 2 billion people are estimated to be already infected, about 10% of which will activate disease, as we heard earlier from Dr. Goozby, even if we could totally perfectly treat all cases of TB and MDR TB today, you will still see TB coming up for decades to come. So indeed, I think what it is a fact that we have moved from the control to stop, as we now begin to see decline in incidence and dramatic declines in mortality, we can now move to the vision of elimination and to end tuberculosis. The tail end is going to be longer than some of the other diseases we're fighting today.
The bedaquiline, first new drug in 40 years or 50 years, whatever it is. You mentioned some others are in the pipeline. Now, is that just the U.S. pipeline, or is it, as I suspect, the European pipeline as well? And how less rigorous might their standards be vis-a-vis FDA than our own that might get it onto the market sooner?
There's a global collaboration to develop new drugs, and Dr. Pablos-Mendez can speak more about this. At CDC, we've participated in clinical trials in many countries. Tuberculosis control is interesting in that there really has been a global collaboration. The U.S. Public Health Service, the Medical Research Council of the United Kingdom, the Japanese, the Hong Kong, many other countries have done some of the best studies of the drug efficacy for any disease ever over a period of decades. There's good global collaboration, and there are definite standards for efficacy. One of the challenges with some of the newer drugs is that there may not be a large number of patients with drug resistance to be tested, and that the outcomes may not be as good as we would like. But there are trials underway, and there have been trials underway for some time to look at what may work better. The new drugs are encouraging, but exactly as was stated earlier, at this point, their role is a reserve role for when the tried and true drugs that are so well documented to be both effective and safe are no longer, unfortunately, effective.
Well, the modern era of antibiotic randomized clinical trials started with tuberculosis, streptomycin back in 1948. We had a period of a lot of products coming in the 50s and 60s, and then we stopped. And we've been using those, which were well deployed, actually can be very effective, but resistance is natural when you use an antibiotic. And indeed, that was the wake-up call back in the year 2000. In the last 15, indeed, the pipelines for tuberculosis, the NIH pumping the pipeline at the basic research levels, companies sharing their chemical libraries, showing new biotech companies. We came with innovation. So now we have a richer pipeline. Tuberculosis is slow. I mean, the nature of the disease means the clinical trials are more complicated, as Tom alluded. And so we have a tradition of that partnership to tackle this disease. MDR-TB is particularly challenging, but nonetheless, as we said, we are proud now. We are entering an era of randomized clinical trials with new drugs for MDR-TB as well.
Let me ask you, Dr. Frieden, in your testimony, you spoke of the 450,000 immigrants and 70,000 refugees who are rigorously screened and before entry into the United States have to be cured prior to entry. Since we do have a very sizable number of people who are not legal, what can be done or what is being done to ensure that they are not carrying this disease? And let me, similar to that, you know, with war and conflict being ever present in so many parts of the world, especially in the Middle East and Syria and Iraq, you know, I'm always reminded that more people died of the misnamed Spanish flu than from World War I. And who knows if that was the proximate cause, but a lot of experts have suggested it probably was laying a groundwork for you know, that terrible disease or that pandemic to occur. You know, is there a risk of a huge exponential explosion because of what's happening in places like Syria and Iraq? And that would be global I'm talking about, but especially in the malaffected area.
In the United States, currently, about 2/3 of all of our tuberculosis cases are among people who were born abroad. Those cases include people from China, from India, from Vietnam, Philippines, from South Korea, and many of them occur in people who've been here for many years because, as has been discussed earlier, tuberculosis resides in your body and can be there for many years before you develop active tuberculosis. There are several things that we're doing to advance this and make further progress. You mentioned the program we have for immigrants and refugees. We think that's a highly successful program. It's been great for the immigrants and refugees. It's been great for their host countries, which have better services, and great for us in this country. One of the components of the antibiotic resistance proposal, which is now under consideration in Congress as part of the FY16 budget, would expand some of that screening program for countries with very high rates of tuberculosis and high numbers of people coming into this country to long-term visitors, such as people coming on certain kinds of work visas or student visas. In addition, it's very important that the services for tuberculosis patients in this country are provided to all patients with tuberculosis, because it's in everybody's interest that they get treated quickly and completely. And that's one of the things that we work very closely with health departments throughout the United States for. Our budget in the U.S. for tuberculosis control is a little bit of over $140 million a year, and with that we make sure that funds are available to treat every patient from a public health standpoint, not just clinically, but to make sure their contacts are followed, that they're provided with support, that they receive directly observed treatment to maximize the likelihood that they will be cured and not develop drug-resistant tuberculosis here, because we know that if that were to happen, it would cost us far more than the prevention costs us today.
In terms of ensuring that U.S. personnel and other healthcare workers around the world are properly protected, I mean, two of you today have said you have TB, only because you cared enough to deal with patients who had TB. What can be done to protect our USAID people, our healthcare professionals, the NGO community? Is there enough being done along those lines? Secondly, in this, I was concerned that the administration's budget had a $45 million cut for TB. I am absolutely sure people in this room are in no way a part of that. I'll never forget when I was chairman of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, I asked Tony Principi, who was then the secretary, who came in with a budget that OMB had slashed to bits, and I said, how much did you ask for that you didn't get? And he said about $1 billion, and we immediately moved the goalposts to include that $1 billion and got it. And he was raked over the coals, so I don't want any of you to get raked over the coals. But if you had additional resources, $236 million is what is likely to be in the 16 budget. Is it enough? You know, again, not taking to task the proposed cut of 45 million, but okay, Congress in a bipartisan way said, not going to happen. We at least want to get up to 236 million. How much more should be provided, in a idealistic world where you really can say, look, this is what it'll do. We know, Dr. Goozby, it's $1 billion short. The over $1 billion globally. If you could maybe speak to that.
Let me take your first question first, Mr. Chairman. There are 3 things we can do to protect Americans working overseas from tuberculosis. The first is to improve the tuberculosis treatment programs in those countries, because TB rates can actually come down quite rapidly. The study that I was part of in India, funded by USAID, done at what's now called the National Institute for Research on Tuberculosis, showed that you could get a very rapid control of tuberculosis prevalence by treating effectively. And if you've got half as many patients around in just 5 years, you have half the risk of getting infected. So the first thing is to help those countries have effective programs. The second is to improve infection control in healthcare facilities. There's still far much TB being spread in healthcare facilities all over the world. And there are a series of things, and at CDC, we've launched a program called TB Basics on infection control that's resulted in very rapid improvements in Nigeria, India, and elsewhere in infection control in healthcare facilities, so that it's less likely that any healthcare workers, US or others, will get infected. The third is on a matter of personal health. It's very important for healthcare workers to be tested periodically to see if they have become infected with either the tuberculosis skin test or another more sophisticated or separate test that would look at whether or not you're infected, and if you are infected, to get preventive treatment. On your second question of resources, exactly 100 years ago, in 1915, one of the great public health leaders in New York City wrote that public health is purchasable. Within natural limitations, a community can determine its own death rate. That was Herman Biggs, and he actually made his career on tuberculosis, establishing rapid diagnostic facilities throughout the city in the 1890s. So some things never change and some things do, but clearly there is a need for more resources to expand programs that are effective, and also to offer countries around the world matching funds so that they will increase their expenditure as well, and to advance innovation so that we have new tools to fight tuberculosis in the coming years.
Chairman Smith, thank you again. And you are right about our own staff facing risks, and we do, of course, follow the guidelines of those who interact with communities or in clinical settings, or who have themselves some vulnerabilities to follow guidance that exists to protect them against getting infected and against reactivating disease. And this is one of the many reasons, if you allow me. I was Saturday, yes, on Saturday, special service to one of the staff of our partners implementing work in Mali, Anita Deitar. She was killed in the terrorist attack at the Radisson Blu Hotel. And I mean, she represents the best of an American hero. And we have many American heroes who have faced the ultimate sacrifice. But when you face the ultimate sacrifice by helping save the lives and improve the lives of others, it deserves our greatest respect and recognition. On the budget question, you are right. I mean, and Tom has already made the point. The United States is right now the largest donor in the fight against tuberculosis control, and that's something we can feel very proud in, not only through the bilateral line, the USAID budget, also through PEPFAR, through the NIH, through the Global Fund. And I'm going to Tokyo next week, where we will begin the replenishment conversation. We need to make sure other countries remain committed also to the fight against AIDS, TB, and malaria. And we have seen the results of that commitment. As we said before, almost cutting half mortality. Incidence was now reversed to go down, and the diagnostic kits going 5-fold, 10-fold, and treatment of MDR-TB 3-fold. We can and we need to do more. We will need new tools. The current tools will get us into other trouble. That is, you treat a patient with MDR-TB, you develop total resistance, etc. But more importantly, we will continue to work on domestic resource mobilization. So we appreciate the support that you have and entrusted in us. We are doing very well with those, but we will need more, and we will need more for the other countries to also come in.
This is great bipartisan teamwork. Democrats and Republicans working together to you know, I think both of you in your testimony, and Dr. Goozby certainly talked about this. we can win this. We can eliminate tuberculosis, right? I mean, it does take a concerted effort, and we just have to look at our own history. I mean, if we think about smallpox in the 20th century, killed hundreds of millions of individuals just in the 20th century, but we came together as a world, as multiple countries, to eliminate smallpox, and the last naturally occurring case of smallpox was in 1977, I believe, in Somalia. We're close on polio. Now, it's not apples to apples. We had a very effective vaccine for both polio and smallpox, but it took a focused worldwide effort to say, we are going to eliminate this, and we did it. So it is going to take that effort, because the downside of not doing it is going to cost us exponentially much more money in resources and lives lost in morbidity. If maybe I'll start with Dr. Frieden. If we're thinking about this, obviously we don't have a vaccine similar to what we had as a tool to fight against smallpox and what we're using to fight against polio. I do know, in Europe they use BCG a fair bit, and certainly in endemic countries they use the tuberculosis vaccine for kids and others. Efficacy of that vaccine, how does that fits into the arsenal?
BCG is the world's most widely used vaccine. It's used at birth in most of the world. It is effective at reducing two particular serious forms of tuberculosis in children, TB meningitis and miliary tuberculosis. Unfortunately, it has very little effectiveness at reducing tuberculosis overall in children or in adults. There have been many efforts to develop better vaccines, but they're challenging. And as you point out, with smallpox and polio, we have had the benefit of vaccines. With tuberculosis, think of the world as those with healthy immune systems and those without healthy immune systems. Among those with healthy immune systems, tuberculosis control programs can result in 95% cure rates and can cut the rate of tuberculosis in half in a decade or less. In the context of HIV and other immunosuppressive conditions, we have many more challenges, and we've seen, of course, exponential increases in Africa. As we expand to HIV treatment, reconstituting the immune systems of whole communities, there's the documentation of a modulation and a reduction in the rate of tuberculosis. But right now, the goal to eliminate tuberculosis globally is aspirational and relies on new technologies.
Dr. Berra, first, I share the spirit that you alluded to, and I like history, so I'm taking the big pictures here, and as you did with smallpox or now in the middle of polio, I mean, we are in the midst of a historical transition in the traditional challenge of global health. We had to always keep our guard up. That's been one of the key lessons of tuberculosis, but it's also in beyond smallpox or now polio, which is close at hand, and thanks to Tom also for the leadership on that space, measles. The reduction in measles, over 80%, reduction in leprosy, over 90%. Many of the NTDs are now slaughtered for eradication as well. We are in a period of which is possible. We have shown it's possible because if we invest the resources, the partnerships, and the commitments, we can indeed roll back many of these things. The idea to end tuberculosis, while aspirational at this point, is directionally correct. As I said before, a few years ago we were still growing. Now we're going down. And that's a very significant shift. We need to continue to make sure that we treat tuberculosis right. DOTS has been the most cost-effective intervention that we had for 25 years. In the SDGs, the Copenhagen Consensus lists the no-brainers, and DOTS remains one of the no-brainer investments for regular TB, for mortality among the poor, and to prevent MDR-TB when done right. So I think that even though it will have a longer tail to end for the reasons we explained earlier about the infections, the long-term nature of the infection, that indeed the vision is correct, the direction is correct, and I think this generation will get us to a point we couldn't have imagined possible 20 years ago.
Absolutely. So again, there's not enough aspirational thinking in this town. So let's aspire to, what we don't know exactly how to do today, but we know that if we don't think about it, if we don't think about this in terms of elimination, we won't get there. So if we're going to continue on this theme of kind of the aspirational goals, if we're laying out, where we make our investments, hypothetically, obviously vaccine development, vaccine research is important. Continuing to have therapies in our arsenal for the existing cases, et cetera. Tom, you touched on the fact that we can't think about this in isolation, right? Because healthy populations, you've got one approach, but as we saw in the 80s and 90s as HIV emerged, you saw this reemergence of tuberculosis. How would you go about treating these comorbid conditions? And
if you go back 100 years, the TB social reformers talked about clearing out the crowded slums where there was no ventilation and people were together. They isolated people who were sick, and they went for better nutrition. Ironically, we've kind of come full circle. We realize that while TB can be cured, we also have to try to improve the social context in which it occurs, because that will reduce the rates. Something like expanding ARV, antiretroviral treatment, to all people who are HIV positive will dramatically reduce TB rates. But in terms of your question about prioritization, I would think of broadly 4 categories. Diagnosis, treatment of disease, treatment of latent TB infection, and then vaccines. Vaccines are challenging since it's hard for us to do better with the vaccine than Mother Nature does. And since we don't have great immunity from tuberculosis, from infection, that makes it challenging, but still well worth doing. A TB vaccine would be worthy of a Nobel Prize. For diagnosis, we have lots of advances, and the really exciting developments with molecular diagnosis are changing the way we do this. We now can identify most of the mutations that lead to resistance to first and second line drugs within a couple of days in sequencing in the laboratory. And that's getting only less expensive, more accessible, quicker. The computing power is big, but we're learning more about that. In terms of treatment, we're looking at new regimens. One of the areas that I think is particularly exciting is the idea of improving the treatment of latent tuberculosis infection. At CDC, our Clinical Trials Consortium, working with others, has identified a 12-dose regimen of weekly isoniazid and rifapentine directly observed as equivalent to other preventive regimens. So you've now got a 12-dose regimen completed in 3 months. If we could add that to studies that would help us identify which of the people with infection are most likely to progress the disease, because currently it's 5 or 10%. So you're treating 85, 90, 95 people to prevent those 5 cases. And if we could identify those individuals, then we could target preventive or treatment of latent TB infection there. We might be able to drive down future cases quite substantially. So there are lots of really exciting areas for research, investigation, and innovation. And of course, the way innovation works, it may be something totally different from these that makes the difference.
Thank you. Indeed, the U.S. government strategy on TB control that was released earlier this year that really brings all of the agencies together has those 3 clear goals: is to reach, to cure, to prevent. And to reach means indeed to go for those who currently are not being diagnosed, and so improving the diagnosis is very important, and we are doing that. Then to treat, cure is paramount. DOTS remains the basis, I think, for most of what we do in the TB control, but now MDR-TB is very important, and then prevent. The vaccine, as you just heard the discussion on vaccines, but also infection control, very important. When we were in New York and the crisis that we had in Eastern Europe on prisons, New York hospitals, Eastern Europe prisons, if you don't isolate patients, you just spread the disease. And so I would just stress that is reaching, curing, and preventing disease is indeed where we are putting our money, is working. We need to do more, and we need to do better. And the investments in research remain significant. We couldn't be here without the research that we invested 10, 20 years ago.
Talk about those investments and have outlined the U.S. investments in terms of combating tuberculosis as well as many other conditions. Who are the big foundational players, philanthropy? Is Gates and others investing?
Gates has done quite a bit in tuberculosis control, as they have in other areas, and they've done the whole gamut of research, from vaccines, to diagnostics, to treatments, to programmatic initiatives in both India and China as well as elsewhere. One of the challenges we have is that although we wish we had better tools, and we hope we will have better tools soon, our currently existing tools are not being used for a large proportion of patients. And that's something that we really need to urgently address. Other countries, such as Japan, also have traditionally invested substantially in tuberculosis control globally.
So first, making sure the tools that we have available are actually available to the countries that need them, right? So again, it brings us back to Gene Expert, which really seems like, try to get that out there as much as possible and get folks using it while we're discovering the next generation of diagnostic and therapies. Thank you.
Let me just ask one final question. The National Action Plan to Combat Drug-Resistant TB, is that soon going to be announced, or has it? I might have missed it.
It's obviously a very important plan and is under development. We don't have a date yet for the release, but you can see we're all champions and we've been working on it.
Finally, I just want to say, again, I think it's been very clear our efforts are bipartisan and very strong. If there's a way this subcommittee could be of help, we're in constant contact with our friends on the appropriations side, Kay Granger, and of course over on the Senate side as well. If there's a way we can be helpful, let me know. Let us know so we can rally the troops, so to speak. And is there any authority, any legal authority that you're lacking, or a push that in legislation that might be helpful? Dr. Pablos-Mendez, you've been very helpful in helping us on our neglected tropical disease legislation, which I think will make a difference. You're doing a magnificent job on it, but we always need to do more. So many people are walking around with parasites and worms. So, if we could be of help, this subcommittee will have your back as best we can to push this. And it's an open door, obviously, because you're leading. But I think the game changer, frankly, was in terms of getting people's attention in Congress was that report from about a month ago, which you really just put in neon lights that this is the leading killer of people by infectious disease in the globe. So if there's any specific authority you need or anything along those lines.
I would say that, first of all, thank you again, because I know that you've been great champions across our programs in global health and for tuberculosis in particular, and bringing attention with this hearing also is part of what we need, and it's been helpful. It's been helpful in our agencies, it's helpful in the U.S. government as a whole. We have a coordination effort across the USG. CDC, of course, has been a partner all along, and we have worked with CDC for many years, even before I was at USAID. They have a particular responsibility domestically, but also great technical partners in the fight against TB globally. The NIH is the lead for research in tuberculosis. The USAID has the lead when it comes to the international TB control efforts and funding and so on. PEPFAR, very important when it comes to TB, HIV, and so on. So I think we have, as you can see in the plan, a coordination platform for our efforts. And domestically, I think Tom can speak to us to how much more we will need. But I like the idea that you had for Dr. Goozby early of linking the parliamentarians to make sure that the voice of tuberculosis is heard across many other halls, because we will need the support not only from our own taxpayers, as I said before, but also from others.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for all of your support for issues to support people with tuberculosis, as well as global health in general, and Dr. Berra, for your deep knowledge and experience with public health and your commitment to it. To answer your specific question about authorities, I think this is something that we'll be having discussions over the coming months. One of the things that we've thought about coming out of the Ebola response was, are there things that would have allowed us to be even quicker in our response, even more effective than we were? So that's one area that we'll be looking at and possibly coming back to you on.
Thank you. On that very thing, I recently met with a group that actually make emergency vehicles that can carry Ebola patients. Turns out it's in my district. I have no financial connection whatsoever. But when I sat, it was with a great deal of attention, which I'll convey to you, but it certainly would have applicability here as well. And we're told that Liberia is very interested in this, so for what it's worth.
When we were with you, Tom,
yes,
we were here together in August the year before, when it was really the depth of the fear and so on and so forth. But really, the transportation was a big, big issue. And so any technology, any innovations that help us on that is certainly welcome.
Thank you. Dr. Burr, thank you, and thank you, gentlemen, and Dr. Goozby, thank you. Without objection, the hearing record will stay open for 5 days, legislative days. There's a number of people or business days, who would like to submit testimony, including, and we have one from the American Thoracic Society. Without objection, so ordered, and the hearing is adjourned, and I thank you very much.
Chairman.